Call off your wedding immediately. The day before my wedding, I found a hidden letter tucked inside my late grandmother's Bible. The handwriting was unmistakable. It read, "Wake up early and go to your future mother-in-law's house. You will see everything." I drove there at dawn, my heart pounding against my ribs. But the moment I stepped inside, I froze. What I saw changed everything entirely. My name is Aliyah, and I am 29 years old. At 5 o'clock in the morning on my wedding day, the air in Atlanta was thick with humidity and the deceptive quiet of dawn. I stood on the porch of Vivian's sprawling Buckhead estate. Vivian was my future mother-in-law, a woman who prided herself on generational wealth, elite social circles, and maintaining a flawless public image. I punched in the spare keypad code DeAndre, my fiancé, had given me months ago. The heavy oak door clicked open with a soft thud. I stepped into the foyer, expecting to find the house asleep before the chaos of our extravagant wedding began. Instead, I heard the sharp, unmistakable clink of crystal glasses and muffled laughter echoing from the sunroom at the back of the house. I walked silently down the marble hallway, the plush runner absorbing the sound of my footsteps. As I neared the partially open French doors of the sunroom, the laughter grew louder. I peered through the narrow gap and the breath left my lungs. DeAndre, the man I was supposed to marry in just a few hours, sat comfortably in a velvet armchair, but he was not alone. Chloe, the woman he swore was just an ex-girlfriend from his college days, was sitting sideways on his lap. Her arms were draped around his neck, and he was casually resting his hand on her thigh. Standing near the bar cart was Vivian, pouring expensive champagne into fluted glasses. Next to her stood Jasmine, DeAndre's 26-year-old sister, who was busy recording a video of her designer shoes for social media. I stood paralyzed, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of the scene. This was not a secret rendezvous. This was a family celebration. "To my brilliant son," Vivian announced, raising her crystal flute high into the air. Her voice dripped with the haughty arrogance she usually reserved for charity galas. "Just smile and get through the ceremony with that ghetto appraiser today." Once she signs the marriage license, her grandmother's 50-acre plot in South Fulton officially enters the marital assets. It is the only way to pay off your $3 million business debt without ruining our family's generational wealth. My blood ran ice cold. $3 million in debt. DeAndre had always portrayed himself as a highly successful entrepreneur, a top-tier graduate who ran his own logistics firm. He drove a luxury sports car and wore custom suits. He had convinced me that his business was thriving. Now, standing in the shadows of his mother's house, I learned the truth. He was drowning in debt, and I was nothing but his financial lifeboat. Jasmine scoffed, reaching for a glass of champagne. "I still cannot believe you have to stand at the altar with her, DeAndre. She is so embarrassing. She does not even come from an HBCU legacy family. Her grandmother literally scrubbed floors for a living. And now she walks around evaluating properties like she actually belongs in our tax bracket. I am going to throw up when I have to call her my sister-in-law." Chloe giggled, trailing a perfectly manicured fingernail down DeAndre's jawline. "You only have to tolerate her for a few months, right, baby?" DeAndre smirked, taking a sip from his glass. "Just until the ink dries on the property transfer documents. Once I use that South Fulton land as collateral to clear my accounts, I will file for divorce. I will make sure the lawyers leave her with nothing. You know I only love you, Chloe. I just need her signature to save the company." "You are a genius, son," Vivian praised, walking over to pat DeAndre on the shoulder. "We built this family name from the ground up. We cannot let bankruptcy destroy our status in Atlanta. Let the little appraiser girl think she hit the jackpot by marrying into our family. She will be back to renting a cheap apartment by Christmas. Any other bride would have burst through those doors. Any other woman would have screamed, cried, slapped the traitor across the face, and demanded an explanation. But I did not shed a single tear. Crying does not pay off debts, and throwing a tantrum does not build power. Nana Pearl, the sweet woman they were currently mocking, had taught me better than that. She taught me how to observe, how to plan, and how to strike only when the victory was absolute. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I made sure the flash was turned off, then held the camera lens up to the crack in the door. I hit record. I captured the high-definition footage of Chloe kissing my fiancé. I recorded Vivian boasting about the $3 million debt and the plot to steal Nana Pearl's land. I captured every single vile, incriminating word that spilled from their mouths. They thought they were dealing with a naive working-class girl who was blinded by the illusion of their high society lifestyle. They thought my grandmother's 50 acres in South Fulton was just a piece of undeveloped dirt they could easily snatch away. What they did not know was that the land sat directly in the center of the largest upcoming commercial zoning project in the state. And I had not just inherited that land, I had used it to build an empire. I was not just a real estate appraiser making a modest salary. That was merely my day job, a strategic cover I used to keep my wealth hidden from opportunistic people. In reality, I was the founder and anonymous chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, a private equity firm that practically owned half the commercial real estate in Atlanta. I stopped recording, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and turned around. I walked out of the house just as silently as I had entered. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing their fate. The morning air felt crisp against my face as I walked down the driveway to my practical, unassuming sedan. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the wealthy neighborhood. I reached into my center console and pulled out a secondary encrypted phone that DeAndre had no idea existed. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. Xavier speaking, my attorney and chief operating officer said. Xavier, it is Aaliyah. Initiate protocol black immediately. I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. Protocol black, Aaliyah, today is your wedding day. Are you absolutely certain? The wedding is still happening, but the groom is going to experience a slight change in his financial portfolio. I need you to buy up every single commercial and personal loan under DeAndre's name. Use the shadow accounts. Pay whatever premium is necessary to expedite the transfer before noon today. I paused, looking back at the massive brick mansion where my enemies were currently toasting to my downfall. And Xavier, I added, a cold smile forming on my lips. Check the mortgage status on Vivian's Buckhead estate. I have a strong feeling she is heavily overleveraged. If she is behind on payments, buy her debt too. I want Vanguard Holdings to own this entire family by the time I walk down the aisle. Consider it done, Xavier replied efficiently. I will have the confirmation documents ready for you before the ceremony. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I started the engine, the quiet hum of the motor grounding me. DeAndre wanted to play a game of deception to save his sinking ship. Vivian wanted to protect her precious social status at the expense of my livelihood. Jasmine wanted to look down on me from her high horse built on credit card debt. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the neighborhood. I was going to give them the society wedding of their dreams. I was going to put on the custom gown smile for the cameras and walk down that white runner. I was going to let them think they had won right up until the exact second I pulled the rug out from under their feet. They wanted a working-class girl to exploit. I was going to show them what a real predator looked like. The drive back to my apartment was peaceful. I watched the city of Atlanta wake up, a city where I held more power than DeAndre and his arrogant mother could ever fathom. I parked my car, walked up to my unit, and began preparing for the day. My phone buzzed with a morning text from DeAndre. Good morning, my beautiful bride. I cannot wait to make you my wife today. I love you so much. I stared at the message, the sheer audacity of his lie making me chuckle. I typed back a swift reply. Good morning, baby. Today is going to be unforgettable. See you at the altar. I tossed the phone onto the bed and walked into the bathroom to shower. The water washed away the last lingering traces of shock. I was ready. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the jaws were about to snap shut. Let them drink their champagne. Let them celebrate their clever little scheme. By the end of this day, I would own their debts, I would own their home, and I would own their futures. The destruction of their fake empire was going to be the most beautiful event this city had ever seen. Fast forward to 10 o'clock in the morning. The bridal suite at the Grand Piedmont Estate was a masterclass in excessive luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the manicured gardens, while crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering light over the velvet seating areas. I sat completely still in a gilded makeup chair as a team of stylists buzzed around me, pinning my hair and applying layers of flawless contour. The air smelled of expensive hairspray and fresh white roses. To anyone else in the room, I was just a quiet, nervous bride preparing for the happiest moment of her life. They had no idea my mind was running 1,000 miles a minute, calculating every single move in a high-stakes game of financial execution. My phone vibrated silently in my silk robe pocket. It was a confirmation from Xavier. The wheels were in motion. DeAndre and his family were currently walking around with empty pockets and fraudulent dreams, completely unaware that Vanguard Holdings was actively acquiring the very debt that would bury them before sunset. I closed my eyes, letting the makeup artist brush a soft, shimmering powder across my cheekbones. I breathed in deeply, savoring the calm before the storm. But in this family, peace was always a temporary illusion. The heavy double doors of the bridal suite suddenly slammed open, hitting the wall with a loud bang that made my makeup artist jump and drop her brush. I opened my eyes and looked into the vanity mirror. Jasmine stood in the doorway, glaring at me through the reflection. She did not bother to knock. She did not offer a single word of greeting or congratulations. She just marched into my private sanctuary like she owned the very air I was breathing. Jasmine was wearing a custom silk gown that cost more than my supposed annual salary as a property appraiser. She carried herself with that unearned arrogance, typical of someone who had never worked a single honest day in her entire life. She sneered at my stylist, waving her hand dismissively. "Leave us," Jasmine commanded, her voice sharp and dripping with condescension. "I need a private word with my future sister-in-law." The makeup artist looked at me hesitantly. I gave her a gentle nod and a polite smile, silently assuring her it was fine. The styling team quickly gathered their brushes and hurried out of the room, closing the door softly behind them. We were entirely alone. I turned my chair around to face her, keeping my expression perfectly serene. "Good morning, Jasmine. You look beautiful today. Is there something you need before the photographer arrives?" Jasmine rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "Save the fake pleasantries, Aaliyah. I am not here to play nice. I am here because my mother sent me on an errand, and frankly, I am already exhausted from having to deal with your entire existence." She strutted over to my vanity, her eyes immediately locking onto my right hand, resting on my lap. Specifically, she was staring at my index finger. "Take it off," Jasmine demanded, pointing a manicured finger at my hand. I glanced down at this emerald ring. It was a massive vintage piece featuring a deep green stone surrounded by a halo of diamonds set in heavy gold. To me, it was priceless. It was the only physical heirloom I had left from Nana Pearl, the woman who had scrubbed floors, saved every penny, and built the foundation of the wealth I now commanded. "I am not taking my grandmother's ring off Jasmine. It is my way of keeping her close to me today," I replied, my voice steady and unbothered. Jasmine scoffed, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Your grandmother was a cleaning lady, Aaliyah. Do not try to dress up your tragic working-class background like it is some beautiful, noble heritage. My mother has been clear from day one. You are marrying into a legacy family today. We have a reputation to uphold in Atlanta society. Vivian insists that you cannot wear cheap ghetto jewelry down the aisle while wearing a designer gown we supposedly paid for. It throws off the entire aesthetic." I remained seated, my posture perfectly straight. "This ring is not cheap, and it certainly is not ghetto. It means everything to me. It stays on my hand." Jasmine took a step closer, towering over me with a venomous glare. "You really do not get it, do you? You do not make the rules here. You are just a lucky girl who managed to trap my brother. My mother wants that ring off your finger right now. In fact, she told me to take it. I need something borrowed for my own solo photo shoot in the courtyard, and that tacky green rock will match my aesthetic perfectly. I will wear it, take my photos, and maybe I will give it back to you after the reception, if I remember." The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She wanted to strip me of my grandmother's memory just to use it as a prop for her social media feed. But I remembered the video sitting securely on my encrypted phone. I remembered her sitting in the sunroom at 5 o'clock in the morning, laughing with DeAndre and Chloe about ruining my life. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. "I am going to say this one last time," I said, keeping my tone deceptively soft. "I am wearing this ring down the aisle. Jasmine slammed her hands down on my vanity, shaking the bottles of perfume and knocking over a tray of lipsticks. Her face twisted into an ugly, entitled snarl. "Listen to me, you pathetic gold digger," Jasmine hissed, leaning in close enough that I could smell her bitter coffee breath. "You are nothing but a charity case to us. DeAndre is doing you the biggest favor of your pathetic life by giving you our last name. Do not test my mother today. Vivian has the caterers on speed dial. She has the venue management in her pocket. If you do not hand over that ring right this second, I will call her. She will cancel the food, she will pull the open bar, and she will humiliate you in front of every single person out there. You will walk down the aisle to empty tables and starving guests. Hand it over." I looked up at her, studying the desperate greed swimming in her eyes. She thought she had me cornered. She thought my entire sense of self-worth was tied to this wedding reception and their fake societal approval. She believed I was terrified of Vivian's wrath. I let a few seconds of heavy silence pass. Then I let out a soft, defeated sigh, playing the role of the broken, submissive bride to absolute perfection. "Fine," I whispered, looking down at my hands as if fighting back tears. "If it means that much to Vivian, you can take it for your photos. Please just do not lose it. It is all I have left of her." I slowly slid the heavy emerald ring off my index finger. The gold caught the light of the chandelier as I held it out. Jasmine snatched it from my palm with lightning speed, a triumphant, wicked smirk spreading across her face. "See, that was not so hard," Jasmine mocked, slipping the ring onto her own finger and admiring it in the mirror. "You just need to learn your place in this family, Aaliyah. Keep your head down, do what my mother says, and maybe we will tolerate you. I will see you at the altar. Try not to trip over your own dress." She spun around on her heels, her expensive silk gown swishing around her legs, and marched out of the suite. She slammed the door behind her, leaving me alone in the quiet room once again. The moment the latch clicked into place, the defeated expression on my face vanished instantly. A genuine, radiant smile broke across my lips. I turned back to the vanity mirror, picked up a tube of crimson lipstick, and carefully applied it to my mouth. Jasmine thought she had just bullied me into handing over my most prized possession. She thought she had exerted her family's dominance and put me in my place. She was absolutely clueless. The real emerald ring, the priceless heirloom that Nana Pearl had given me on her deathbed, was currently locked away in a climate-controlled high-security vault at Vanguard Holdings headquarters. I would never under any circumstances bring something so precious anywhere near the venomous snakes in DeAndre's family. The ring Jasmine had just forcefully stolen from me was a $40 cubic zirconia replica I had ordered on Amazon Prime with free overnight shipping earlier this week. I had anticipated they would try to strip me of my confidence today. I knew Vivian would find some way to insult my heritage and demand submission. Jasmine was currently parading around the venue, snapping photos for her fake wealthy followers, wearing a piece of cheap glass made in a factory overseas. I laughed softly, shaking my head at their predictable vanity. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not tell the difference between genuine value and a cheap imitation. It was the perfect metaphor for their entire family legacy. I picked up my encrypted phone and sent a quick text to Xavier. "Jasmine took the bait. The replica is in her possession. Proceed with the final phase of the asset acquisition." Xavier responded seconds later. "Asset acquisition is complete. Vanguard Holdings now officially owns the Buckhead Estate mortgage. DeAndre's business loans are secured in our portfolio. You hold the leash." A surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins. The table was set. The final pieces of my revenge were locked into place. I placed the phone back into my pocket and smoothed out the intricate lace on my bodice. I was ready to walk out there and end this charade. But just as I stood up from the vanity chair, the heavy double doors of the bridal suite swung open once again. The smile faded from my lips as I braced myself for the next wave of conflict. This time it was not Jasmine. Vivian strode into the room, her chin held high, radiating absolute hostility. She was dressed in an elaborate silver gown that looked dangerously close to white, a deliberate insult to my position as the bride. However, she was not alone. Flanking her on either side were two imposing men in dark tailored suits carrying thick leather briefcases. I recognized the predatory look in their eyes immediately. They were corporate lawyers, the kind of men hired to destroy lives through legal loopholes and aggressive contracts. Vivian stopped in the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over my wedding dress with undisguised disgust. She signaled to the lawyers, and one of them stepped forward, unlatching his briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. The second phase of their trap had arrived. The two corporate lawyers flanking Vivian looked like they had been manufactured in a boardroom specifically designed for intimidation. They wore identical charcoal suits, their expressions wiped clean of any human empathy. One of them, a tall man with a sharp jawline, stepped forward and snapped his leather briefcase open. He withdrew a thick, professionally bound stack of legal documents and dropped it onto my marble vanity with a heavy thud. Vivian stepped up right behind him. She crossed her arms over her silver gown, looking down at me as if I were a stain on her expensive rug. "Sign this," Vivian ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. "Or there is no wedding today. In our circles, we protect our assets from gold diggers. It is a non-negotiable prenuptial agreement." I looked from the towering stack of paper to Vivian's smug face. She was not just asking me to sign a contract. She was trying to publicly humiliate me, asserting dominance, right before I walked down the aisle. She wanted to remind me that in her eyes, I was nothing more than a poor working-class girl desperately trying to secure a bag. "A prenuptial agreement?" I asked. Keeping my voice soft, I feigned perfect shock. "Vivian DeAndre and I never discussed a prenup. The wedding is in less than 2 hours. Why are you bringing this to me now at the very last minute?" "Because my son is too soft-hearted," Vivian sneered, waving her hand dismissively. "He thinks love is enough to build a generational empire. But I know better. I have seen girls like you before, Aaliyah. You play the supportive girl. But the moment things get difficult, you file for divorce and try to take half of everything my family has worked for. I will not allow you to leech off my son's success. We have a legacy in Atlanta, and I am protecting it." Her arrogance was almost comical. She was lecturing me about protecting her wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that Vanguard Holdings had just finalized the purchase of her overdue mortgage. Her precious legacy was currently sitting in a default folder on my chief operating officer's desk. I slowly reached out and pulled the heavy stack of paper toward me. 50 pages is a lot to read on my wedding day, Vivian. I do not have counsel." The second lawyer spoke up, his tone flat and mechanical. "The document is standard for a family of this financial stature. It simply states that what belongs to the groom remains with the groom, and you waive all rights to spousal support." I nodded slowly, pretending to be intimidated by his legal jargon. But I was not a naive bride. I dealt with commercial real estate contracts worth tens of millions of dollars every single day. My eyes were trained to catch the fine print, the hidden clauses, the subtle traps that predatory lawyers buried deep within pages. I flipped through these pages, skimming the standard clauses about property division and bank accounts. It all looked like a standard, albeit aggressive, prenuptial agreement. But as I turned to page 42, my eyes snagged on a dense paragraph buried under a section labeled Marital Debt and Liabilities. The legal jargon was thick, designed to confuse a layman, but to a corporate executive like me, it was glaringly obvious. The clause stated that by signing this document, I was agreeing to assume joint liability for all of DeAndre's pre-existing business debts. It explicitly outlined that any financial obligations tied to his logistics firm would be shared equally by both parties upon the execution of the marriage license. My breath caught in my throat. I had to force myself to keep my expression completely neutral. They were not trying to protect their assets from me. They had no assets left to protect. They were literally trying to legally chain me to his $3 million bankruptcy. They knew about Nana Pearl's land. They knew its potential value. They wanted to ensure that if DeAndre's creditors came knocking, they could legally seize my inheritance to settle his fraudulent accounts. It was a masterclass in financial manipulation wrapped up in the disguise of a protective high society prenup. They were serving me on a silver platter to the wolves, and they expected me to say thank you. Just as I was reading the final line of the trap, the door to the bridal suite opened again. DeAndre rushed into the room, already dressed in his custom-tailored white tuxedo. He looked incredibly handsome, the picture-perfect groom, but I could see the frantic, nervous energy burning behind his eyes. He needed this signature. His entire fraudulent existence depended on it. "Mom, what is going on here?" DeAndre asked, playing the role of the distressed protective fiancé flawlessly. He walked over to me, placing his hands gently on my bare shoulders. He looked down at the thick document, then glared at his mother. "I told you I did not want to do this today. You are stressing her out." "DeAndre, be a man and handle your business," Vivian snapped back, playing her part in their orchestrated routine. "I am doing this for your own good. I am not letting you walk down that aisle until her signature is on that paper. This family comes first." DeAndre sighed heavily, running a hand over his freshly lined-up haircut. He knelt beside my chair, bringing himself down to my eye level. He took my hands in his thumbs rubbing soothing circles over my knuckles. It was the same charming, affectionate gesture that had won me over 2 years ago. Now it just made my skin crawl. "Baby, I am so sorry about this," DeAndre whispered, his voice low and incredibly smooth. "You know how my mom is about our family legacy. She has been dealing with all these crazy socialite friends who got taken advantage of in their marriages, and she is just being paranoid. She hired these lawyers behind my back." I looked into his eyes, marveling at how easily he lied to my face. The man I thought I loved was a phantom. The real DeAndre was a desperate drowning fraud who had spent his morning kissing his ex-girlfriend and plotting my financial ruin. "DeAndre, this document is 50 pages long," I said, making my voice tremble just enough to sound overwhelmed. "It says I have to take on your liabilities. I do not even know what that means." DeAndre's eyes flickered with a brief, barely noticeable flash of panic. He quickly covered it up with a warm, reassuring smile. He leaned in and kissed my forehead tenderly. "It is just standard legal nonsense, baby." DeAndre coaxed, his tone sweet and persuasive. "The lawyers put that in all these contracts to justify their hourly rates. It does not mean anything. My business is booming, you know that. I do not have any liabilities for you to worry about." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He pressed it gently into my palm, wrapping my fingers around the cool metal. "Just sign it to keep the peace, Aaliyah. Just to get my mother off our backs so we can enjoy our day. I promise you I will rip this entire contract up the minute we get back from our honeymoon in the Maldives. It will be like it never existed. Do you not trust me?" The manipulation was seamless. He was banking on my love, my supposed insecurity around his wealthy mother, and my desire to avoid a massive confrontation on our wedding day. He thought I was desperate to become his wife. I looked from DeAndre's pleading, handsome face to Vivian's cold, expectant glare. I looked at the two corporate lawyers who were literally holding their breath, waiting for the trap to snap shut. My mind flashed back to the video on my encrypted phone. I remembered Chloe sitting on his lap. I remembered Vivian calling me a ghetto appraiser. I remembered them laughing about stealing Nana Pearl's land to pay off the $3 million debt he was currently lying about to my face. They wanted to play a high-stakes legal game. They wanted to use signatures and contracts to bind me to their sinking ship. But a contract is only binding if the person signing it is actually executing it in good faith. And I had absolutely zero good faith left for this arrogant, fraudulent family. I let a soft, adoring smile spread across my face. I looked deeply into DeAndre's eyes, letting my features soften into absolute devotion. "Of course I do, baby," I whispered sweetly. "I trust you completely. I would do anything for us." DeAndre let out a heavy sigh of relief, the tension leaving his shoulders. He stood up, nodding to the lawyers. The sharp-jawed attorney quickly flipped the thick document to the final page, pointing a manicured finger at the blank signature line. "Sign right here, please, and print your name directly below it," the lawyer instructed. I took the gold pen. The ink flowed smoothly as I pressed the nib to the thick parchment paper. I did not hesitate. I signed the document with a beautiful, sweeping, elegant signature. It looked professional and authoritative, but I did not sign my real legal name. I did not sign Alia Marie Washington. Years ago, during a complex real estate acquisition where I needed to protect my identity from a particularly aggressive competitor, I had my legal team establish a completely separate, airtight alias. It was a phantom identity entirely disconnected from my social security number, my Vanguard Holdings assets, and my personal credit profile. It was a name that legally did not exist in any capacity that could be tied to my real life. I signed the contract using that void, untraceable alias. I wrote the letters with careful precision, answering every loop and curve was flawless. I was not legally binding myself to his $3 million debt. I was binding a ghost to a sinking ship. I handed the gold pen back to DeAndre and pushed the signed contract across the marble vanity toward the lawyers. The sharp-jawed attorney quickly snatched it up, inspecting the signature page with a satisfied smirk. He closed his briefcase with a loud snap. "Excellent," Vivian said, a triumphant gleam lighting up her cold eyes. She looked at me like a butcher looking at a slaughtered lamb. "You made the right choice, Aaliyah. Now finish getting ready. You have a long day ahead of you." Vivian turned on her heel and marched out of the bridal suite, the two lawyers trailing dutifully behind her like obedient dogs. DeAndre leaned down and kissed me firmly on the lips. "Thank you, baby. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I will see you at the altar." "I cannot wait," I replied, my voice steady. DeAndre left the room, closing the heavy double doors behind him. I was completely alone again. I turned back to the vanity mirror. My reflection stared back at me, looking very fierce and entirely unbroken. I picked up a makeup brush and smoothed out a tiny imperfection in my blush. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had secured their financial salvation by forcing me to sign away my grandmother's legacy. They were celebrating a victory that did not actually exist. The prenup was completely void, their debts were currently being transferred into my corporate portfolio, and their multi-million-dollar mansion was officially in foreclosure. I stood up from the chair and walked to my custom wedding gown hanging in the corner. It was finally my time now. I smoothed my heavy silk skirt and stepped out of the bridal suite. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a lavish cocktail lounge for VIP guests. This was Vivian's demand, an opportunity to parade her wealthy friends and show off the opulent lifestyle she supposedly built. I walked down the marble staircase into a sea of Atlanta elite. There were local politicians and matriarchs wearing hats that cost more than my supposed monthly salary. Vivian spotted me immediately. Holding a crystal glass of champagne, she stood surrounded by a tight circle of country club friends. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed, but she quickly plastered on a fake smile. She waved me over, her diamond bracelets clinking. I took a deep breath, maintaining my serene expression, and walked into the lion's den. "Ladies, look who finally joined us," Vivian announced loudly to draw the attention of surrounding guests. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and pulled me into the center. "This is Aaliyah, the bride. I was just telling everyone about your quaint little background." A chorus of pitying murmurs rippled through the wealthy women. They looked me up and down, evaluating the custom gown they assumed DeAndre had paid for. "Aaliyah comes from a humble family," Vivian continued. "Her grandmother was a domestic worker. She scrubbed floors right here in the city. Now look at her granddaughter marrying into our family. DeAndre has such a huge heart. He is practically running a charity by taking this girl out of her tiny apartment and giving her our prestigious last name. We are proud of his generosity." The backhanded compliments felt like physical strikes, but I did not flinch. I did not let my smile waver. The women exchanged knowing glances, sipping their drinks and nodding sympathetically at Vivian, praising her for being accepting of a working-class girl. They thought I was standing there feeling small, humiliated, and eternally grateful for the breadcrumbs of their elite society. They had no idea I could buy this entire estate in cash. They did not know the country club they belonged to leased its land from Vanguard Holdings, meaning I was technically their landlord. I looked at Vivian's smug face, thinking about the foreclosure notice currently sitting in my inbox. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, my voice smooth. My grandmother was indeed a hard-working woman. She taught me the value of building real things from the ground up. She always said true wealth is quiet, and only the desperate feel the need to shout about it. I am blessed to carry her lessons today. Vivian's fake smile twitched. The underlying insult went over the heads of her friends, but Vivian caught the edge in my tone. She opened her mouth to deliver another jab, but a sudden commotion near the grand entrance drew the attention of the entire room. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the chatter instantly died down. I turned my head, and what I saw made my blood boil even though I had fully anticipated their disrespect. Chloe had arrived. DeAndre's ex-girlfriend. The woman I caught sitting on his lap at 5 o'clock this morning stood in the doorway. She was wearing a floor-length form-fitting white silk gown. The dress featured a plunging neckline and a dramatic train that swept across the floor. She looked exactly like a bride. It was a calculated, deeply disrespectful insult designed to humiliate me in front of hundreds of people. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Wearing white to another woman's wedding was the ultimate social taboo, but Chloe wore it with an unapologetic smirk. She strutted into the room, her hips swaying, locking eyes with me from across the floor. DeAndre immediately broke away from his fraternity brothers and hurried over to her. Any decent groom would have quietly escorted an offending guest out of the venue to protect his bride. Instead, DeAndre greeted Chloe with a massive grin. He pulled her into a tight, lingering embrace, his hands resting comfortably on her bare back. He kissed her cheek, whispering something that made her throw her head back and laugh loudly. Vivian immediately abandoned my side and rushed over to join them, ignoring the scandalized looks of her friends. She threw her arms around Chloe, pulling the woman in the white gown into a warm, loving hug. "Chloe, darling, you look absolutely stunning," Vivian gushed, making sure her voice carried across the silent room. "I am so incredibly happy you made it today. You have always been the daughter I always wanted. The energy you bring to this family is irreplaceable." The sheer audacity of her statement was staggering. Vivian was publicly claiming her son's mistress as her true daughter, right in front of the woman he was supposed to marry in less than an hour. She wanted to break my spirit. She wanted me to feel isolated, pathetic, and utterly defeated before I even reached the altar. She wanted me to know that no matter what papers I signed, I would never belong to them. I stood alone in the center of the room, wearing my wedding gown, while my groom and my future mother-in-law openly fawned over a woman dressed in white. I could feel the pitying stares of the guests burning into the side of my face. Some whispered behind their hands while others blatantly stared, waiting to see if I would run out of the room crying. But I did not cry. I did not yell. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy calm of my true power wash over me. I did not need to fight for my place in a family built on a foundation of lies and debt. I did not need to defend my grandmother's honor to people who financed luxury cars with fraudulent loans. I just needed to execute my plan. I turned away from the sickening display of affection and walked calmly toward a quiet alcove near the tall, arched windows. The light filtering through the glass cast dramatic shadows across the intricate stonework of the floor. I slipped my hand into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out my encrypted phone. I opened my secure messaging application and quickly typed a message to Xavier. "Are the papers secured?" I texted. "I need full confirmation before the music starts." The seconds ticked by, feeling like hours. I watched DeAndre pour Chloe a glass of champagne, their fingers brushing intimately as he handed it to her. I watched Vivian laugh at a joke Chloe made, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. They were so confident in their cruelty. They truly believed they held all the power in the room. They thought they had manipulated the system and secured their wealthy future on the back of my grandmother's hard-earned land. My phone vibrated in my palm. I looked down at the illuminated screen. It was a message from Xavier. Signed, sealed, and delivered, the message read. "The transactions are officially complete. Vanguard Holdings has successfully acquired all of DeAndre's commercial and personal debt portfolios. Furthermore, the deed and mortgage to Vivian's Buckhead estate have been fully transferred to our Distressed Assets Division. You have complete legal authority to foreclose and evict. We own them." A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The weight of the moment settled deep into my bones. The trap had officially snapped shut. DeAndre and Vivian were currently celebrating their cleverness, completely unaware that they were standing in a venue drinking champagne, while their entire financial existence had just been legally wiped out. They were parading around in designer clothes, pretending to be Atlanta elite, while I held the literal deeds to their lives in the palm of my hand. The irony was absolutely delicious. They spent the morning trying to make me feel small, but in reality, they were the ones who had been reduced to nothing. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my heart beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. The time for observation was over. The time for execution had arrived. The anticipation was intoxicating, a thrilling rush of adrenaline that sharpened my focus. Every insult, every sneer, every microaggression had only fueled my determination. I was ready to burn their fake empire to the ground. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors leading to the main chapel swung open. The grand sweeping notes of a string quartet began to fill the air, signaling the end of the cocktail hour. The wedding coordinator, a frantic woman with a headset and a clipboard, rushed into the room, clapping her hands loudly to get everyone's attention over the buzzing crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, please make your way to the chapel," she announced brightly, her voice strained with professional cheerfulness. "The ceremony is about to begin. It is time for the groom to take his place at the altar." DeAndre gave Chloe one last lingering smile, his eyes filled with false promises. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, adjusted his bow tie, and walked confidently toward the chapel doors. Vivian followed closely behind him, shooting me a final victorious glare before disappearing into the massive crowd of moving guests. The guests slowly filtered out of the grand room, their hushed whispers fading into the distance. Soon I was left standing alone with my bridal party. The music shifted, the low, romantic hum of the cello vibrating through the solid floorboards beneath my feet. I smoothed the skirt of my dress one last time, feeling the heavy, beautiful weight of the fabric settling around my legs. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of lilies and revenge. I looked straight ahead at the open chapel doors, where the long white runner stretched perfectly all the way to the altar. The brilliant stained glass windows cast colorful patterns of light across the wooden pews, creating a picture-perfect setting for the ultimate deception. The traditional wedding march finally began to play its familiar chords, echoing through the vast space. It was officially time to walk down the aisle. The heavy wooden doors of the chapel stood wide open, framing the long, pristine white runner that stretched toward the altar. The stained glass windows cast an ethereal glow over the pews, painting the room in hues of violet and gold. The string quartet played the opening notes of the bridal march, the melody floating through the air with a false sense of romance. I adjusted my veil, ensuring it perfectly framed my face, and began my slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. Every eye in the room turned toward me. The pews were packed with 300 of Atlanta's most elite and pretentious socialites. These were Vivian's people. The same people who had just spent the last hour whispering about my working-class background and analyzing the cost of my dress. They smiled at me now, their expressions a carefully rehearsed mask of polite joy. I kept my chin high and my shoulders pulled back, radiating a quiet, absolute confidence that none of them could possibly understand. I was not walking toward my happily ever after. I was marching directly into a battlefield, armed with the financial execution papers that would dismantle their entire world. As I neared the front of the chapel, my eyes locked onto DeAndre. He stood at the altar looking incredibly handsome in his white tuxedo. His hands were clasped respectfully in front of him, and he wore a gentle, loving smile that could have easily fooled anyone who did not know the monster hiding beneath the surface. He looked like a man who had just secured his future. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the 50-page prenuptial agreement I had signed in the bridal suite was currently binding me to his massive fraudulent debt. He thought Nana Pearl's 50 acres in South Fulton were already his to leverage. I reached the altar and handed my bouquet to my maid of honor. DeAndre reached out and took both of my hands in his. His palms were slightly sweaty, betraying the nervous anticipation he was desperately trying to hide. He squeezed my fingers, gently leaning in close. "You look absolutely breathtaking, baby," DeAndre whispered, his voice smooth and convincing. "I am so lucky to be marrying you today." "You have no idea," I replied, my voice steady and sweet. The pastor, an older, distinguished man with a booming voice, stepped up to the podium and began the ceremony. He spoke eloquently about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage. He talked about building a legacy together and weathering the storms of life as a united front. The sheer hypocrisy of his words, considering the people standing before him, was almost too much to bear. Vivian sat in the front row, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Next to her sat Jasmine, still wearing the cheap cubic zirconia ring she had bullied me into handing over, completely oblivious to its true worth. Chloe sat just a few rows back, her white silk gown glowing in the stained glass light, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. They were all playing their parts, perfectly convinced that they had successfully orchestrated my ultimate downfall. We will now hear the vows that the bride and groom have prepared for each other, the pastor announced, stepping back to give us the floor. DeAndre cleared his throat, looking deeply into my eyes. He began reciting his vows, his voice echoing through the silent chapel. He spoke about building a legacy together, about honesty, and about protecting me for the rest of his life. He promised to be my rock, my partner, and my equal. The audience swooned, some of the women actually wiping away genuine tears. It was a phenomenal performance worthy of an award. But I stared right through him, seeing the desperate, calculating fraud hiding behind his charming words. Alia, my beautiful bride, DeAndre concluded, his voice thick with fake emotion. I promise to love you, to honor you, and to cherish you until my last breath. I am yours completely. He smiled, a look of pure, arrogant triumph flashing briefly in his eyes. He thought he had sealed the deal. He thought I was completely under his spell. The pastor turned to me. Aaliyah, you may now share your vows. I took a deep breath, the heavy silence of the chapel pressing in on me. This was the moment. I looked directly into DeAndre's eyes, dropping the sweet, adoring facade I had maintained all morning. My expression hardened into something cold, calculating, and entirely ruthless. DeAndre, I began, my voice ringing out clear and strong, cutting through the heavy air of the chapel. I stand before you today with a very clear understanding of exactly who you are and what you value most. I promise to give you exactly what you have earned. I promise to hold you fully accountable for every single word you have spoken in the dark and every secret you thought you had buried. DeAndre's smile faltered slightly. Confusion flickered across his face. These were not the sweet, submissive vows he had been expecting. Vivian shifted uncomfortably in the front row, her perfectly manicured hands tightening around her designer clutch. I promise to expose the truth. I continued, my voice unwavering. And I promise to protect my grandmother's legacy from those who seek to destroy it. A low murmur rippled through the pews. The guests exchanged bewildered glances. This was not a traditional declaration of love. It sounded like a warning. It sounded like a threat. DeAndre squeezed my hands tighter, his grip almost painful. Baby, what are you doing? He whispered fiercely through a forced, tight-lipped smile. Just read the vows we practiced. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on his panicking face. I slowly pulled my hands out of his grip, taking a deliberate step back from the altar. The pastor, clearly sensing the mounting tension, quickly stepped forward to regain control of the ceremony. He rushed to the most critical part of the traditional service, hoping to push past the awkward moment. Before we proceed, the pastor announced, his voice booming over the confused murmurs of the crowd. If anyone can show just cause why these two may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The chapel fell completely silent. The heavy, suffocating tension in the room was palpable. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the uncomfortable moment to pass so the ceremony could conclude. I lowered my arms, letting them rest at my sides. I looked at Vivian, who was glaring at me with undisguised hatred. I looked at Chloe, who was leaning forward in her pew, a look of nervous anticipation on her face. I looked back at DeAndre, whose handsome face was quickly draining of color. I reached out and took the microphone directly from the pastor's hand. The sudden movement caused a sharp screech of feedback to echo through the sound system, making several guests wince and cover their ears. I held the microphone up to my mouth, my voice steady and amplified across the massive chapel. I object. The two words echoed through the cavernous chapel, amplified by the heavy microphone I held in my hand. For a fraction of a second, the entire venue ceased to breathe. 300 guests froze in their solid oak pews. The string quartet stopped playing with a discordant screech of a bow against a cello string. The pastor blinked his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses, completely unsure of how to proceed with the ceremony. DeAndre stared at me. The charming camera-ready smile completely melted off his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked around at the silent crowd, the wealthy elite of Atlanta, who were now sitting on the absolute edge of their velvet seats. He let out a nervous, strained laugh that sounded much more like a choke than a genuine expression of humor. "Baby, this isn't a joke," DeAndre whispered fiercely, stepping toward me with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Put the microphone down. You are embarrassing us in front of everyone." "I am not joking, DeAndre," I replied, my voice steady and cold, projecting clearly across the massive room. "I told you I was going to hold you accountable for every word spoken in the dark." I turned my gaze away from his panicking face and looked toward the elevated sound booth at the very back of the chapel. I caught the eye of the lead audiovisual technician. I gave him a single sharp nod. Instantly, the massive state-of-the-art projection screens mounted behind the altar flickered to life. These were the screens Vivian had insisted on renting to display a carefully curated, highly edited romantic slideshow of our relationship during the ceremony. She wanted everyone to see the perfect, flawless aesthetic of her son settling down. But instead of a montage of our engagement photos, the screens illuminated the chapel with crisp 4K resolution footage from exactly 5 o'clock this morning. The sudden blast of audio from the venue's premium surround sound system made the guests physically jump in their seats. The high-definition video filled the massive screens, showing a slightly angled but crystal-clear view into Vivian's luxurious sunroom. The entire congregation gasped in unison as the towering digital displays revealed DeAndre sitting in a velvet armchair. But the collective gasp turned into a wave of horrified murmurs when they saw Chloe, the woman currently sitting just 3 rows back in a white silk gown, straddling DeAndre's lap on the screen. The video showed him resting his hand intimately on her bare thigh while she traced his jawline. "To my brilliant son!" Vivian's recorded voice boomed through the chapel speakers, echoing off the stained glass windows. On the screen, Vivian raised a crystal flute of champagne, completely unaware that she was being filmed. Her haughty, arrogant tone was unmistakable. "Just smile and get through the ceremony with that ghetto appraiser today," the recorded Vivian sneered, taking a sip of her drink. A collective shudder went through the pews. I watched as Vivian's wealthy country club friends, her sorority sisters, and her fellow church board members turned their heads to stare at her. Vivian sat in the front row, her face draining of all color until she looked like a ghost. Her hands gripped the wooden pew so tightly, her knuckles turned bright white. The video continued to play mercilessly, exposing their entire plot to the elite society they worshipped. Once she signs the marriage license, her grandmother's 50-acre plot in South Fulton officially enters the marital assets, the recorded Vivian boasted proudly on the massive screens. "It is the only way to pay off your $3 million business debt without ruining our family's generational wealth." The chapel erupted into total chaos. The murmurs turned into loud, scandalous whispers and exclamations of shock. $3 million in debt. The golden boy of Buckhead, the supposed self-made logistics mogul, was completely broke. The flawless generational wealth narrative that Vivian had aggressively shoved down everyone's throats for decades was a complete and utter lie. They were drowning in massive debt, and they were using a wedding to steal a working-class grandmother's land to save themselves from total ruin. Jasmine's voice then echoed through the speakers, her face appearing on the screen as she recorded her shoes. "I still cannot believe you have to stand at the altar with her, DeAndre. She is so embarrassing to be around. Her grandmother literally scrubbed floors for a living." People in the pews were pulling out their phones. Hundreds of glowing screens popped up across the dark chapel as guests began recording the projection screens, capturing the downfall of Atlanta's most arrogant family. The high society reputation Vivian had spent a lifetime ruthlessly protecting shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. Everyone was recording the absolute humiliation of the year. Chloe realized what was happening. She scrambled in her pew, trying to cover her face with her designer clutch to hide from the dozens of camera lenses suddenly pointing in her direction. She looked like a trapped animal desperately trying to shrink down into the wooden bench, her white silk dress suddenly looking like a massive glowing target. She attempted to slide out of the row, but the guests surrounding her refused to move, trapping the mistress right in the middle of the intense fallout. "Turn it off!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She jumped up from the front pew, her silver dress rustling wildly. She pointed a shaking finger at the sound booth. "Turn that off right now. I demand you cut the audio and video feed immediately. Someone stop this madwoman before she ruins our entire reputation." The audiovisual technician, whom I had personally paid triple his daily rate early this morning, completely ignored her demands. He simply crossed his arms and let the video play. On the screen, Chloe's giggling voice filled the room. "You only have to tolerate her for a few months, right, baby? Just until the ink dries on the property transfer documents," the recorded DeAndre smirked. "Once I use that South Fulton land as collateral to clear my accounts, I will file for divorce. I will make sure our lawyers leave her with absolutely nothing. You know I only love you, Chloe. I just need her signature to save the company from going under." "Stop it!" Vivian shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face in disarray. She turned to the crowd, waving her hands frantically, trying to control a narrative that had already burned to the ground. "Do not listen to this. It is deepfake technology. It is artificial intelligence. This girl is a deranged, paranoid liar who is trying to extort my wealthy family. She is making all of this up to embarrass us because she is terribly jealous of our elite status." Nobody believed her pathetic lies. The footage was too raw, too real, and too perfectly matched to the people standing right in front of them. The disgusted looks from her fellow socialites said everything. She was utterly ruined. Her country club memberships, her charity gala invitations, her entire social standing was completely dead and buried. I stood calmly at the altar holding the microphone, watching the absolute destruction of their fake empire. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply let their own arrogant words do all the heavy lifting. Nana Pearl had always told me that if you give an arrogant person enough rope, they will eventually hang themselves. Today they provided the rope, tied the knot, and built the gallows all on their own. DeAndre was visibly trembling. The veins in his neck bulged against his white tuxedo collar. The charming, charismatic facade he had worn for 2 long years had completely evaporated, revealing the cowardly, desperate fraud underneath. He realized that every single person in his professional and social network now knew he was a failure who had to con a woman to pay off his massive debts. He turned to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from his body was palpable. He took a threatening step toward me, but he remembered we were standing in front of 300 recording cell phones. He could not touch me. He could only stand there and burn in the fire of his own making. "You think you are so smart," DeAndre hissed, stepping close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his face. His voice was low, meant only for me, vibrating with a venomous rage. "You think a stupid video changes anything about what is going to happen today?" I looked up at him, my expression perfectly blank. "It changes everything, DeAndre. Everyone knows exactly what you are." DeAndre let out a harsh, wicked laugh, a sound entirely devoid of any sanity. He leaned in his face inches from mine, his eyes gleaming with a manic, desperate victory. "It does not change a single thing," DeAndre spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Because you are too late, Aaliyah. You already played right into our hands. You signed the prenup 30 minutes ago in the bridal suite. You signed the legally binding contract right in front of my mother and 2 highly respected corporate lawyers." His chest heaved as he smiled, a truly sinister smile. He thought he still held the trump card. He thought he had successfully chained me to the bottom of the ocean. "You are legally bound to my debt now, you stupid girl." DeAndre snarled, his eyes wide with malicious triumph. "You own that $3 million deficit, whether we get married today or not. You thought you could embarrass me in front of my city, but I just took your grandmother's land and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. You belong to me now, and you always will. My brilliant legal team will ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic, lonely life paying off the unfortunate financial mistakes I made in the past. I will be living comfortably in my family's historic Buckhead mansion while you suffer in absolute poverty." You really thought you were the one holding all the power here today. You are absolutely nothing without me. You walked into this financial trap willingly, and now you have to pay the ultimate price. Enjoy your new reality, because this is the absolute end of the line for you and your beloved grandmother's precious legacy. I completely own you, and there is absolutely nothing you can. The chapel was dead silent, following his aggressive declaration. 300 guests held their collective breath, waiting to see how I would respond to his vicious threat. DeAndre stood there, his chest heaving with exertion, a victorious and malicious glint in his eyes. He fully believed he had won the ultimate chess match. He truly thought he had outmaneuvered me and secured his financial salvation by tricking me into signing that heavy stack of legal documents. I looked at his flushed, arrogant face, and I did not feel a single ounce of fear or intimidation. Instead, a genuine, deep, and commanding laugh bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest. It started as a soft chuckle and quickly grew into a rich, resonant laugh that echoed loudly through the vaulted ceiling of the chapel. My laughter completely shattered the heavy tension in the room. DeAndre recoiled, his triumphant smirk instantly vanishing. His dark eyes darted around the room, clearly unnerved by my reaction. He had expected me to crumble to my knees, beg for mercy, or scream in terror at the prospect of inheriting $3 million of fraudulent debt. My utter lack of panic thoroughly confused him. "What is so funny?" DeAndre demanded, his voice cracking slightly as his false confidence began to rapidly dissolve. "Are you in shock? Did you not hear a single word I just said to you? You are legally chained to my financial liabilities for the rest of your life." I stopped laughing and took a deliberate step closer to him, closing the physical distance he had tried to establish. I leveled my gaze directly into his terrified eyes. "You are referring to the airtight prenuptial agreement I signed in the bridal suite just 30 minutes ago." I said, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone so every single guest could hear the impending destruction. "The incredibly detailed contract your mother brought to me, escorted by her two intimidating corporate lawyers." "Exactly." DeAndre spat, though his posture had grown stiff and defensive. "You signed it right in front of them." "I certainly signed a document," I replied, a razor-sharp smile curving my lips. "But tell me, DeAndre, how exactly does your brilliant legal team plan to enforce a 50-page financial contract that was officially signed using the name Mickey Mouse?" The absolute silence that fell over the chapel was deafening. DeAndre froze completely, his mouth falling open in a pathetic display of shock. His entire body went rigid, as if he had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. "What did you just say?" Vivian shrieked from the front row. She scrambled to her feet, her silver gown rustling aggressively as she stepped toward the altar. "That is impossible. My lawyers watched you sign that document with their own eyes." I turned my attention to the hysterical matriarch. "They watched me drag a gold pen across a piece of paper, Vivian. But none of you arrogant fools actually bothered to verify the signature itself. You were so blinded by your own arrogance and so eager to trap a working-class girl that you rushed the execution. I did not sign my legal name. I used a completely void, untraceable phantom, alias that I keep specifically for dealing with predatory bottom feeders like your family. That prenuptial agreement is not worth the paper it is printed on. It holds absolutely zero legal weight in the state of Georgia." DeAndre stumbled backward, physically reeling from the impact of my words. He grabbed the edge of the altar to steady himself. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The $3 million safety net he thought he had successfully secured had just evaporated into thin air. Vivian's face contorted with a mixture of terror and unbridled fury. "You lying, manipulative little street trash!" she screamed, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her refined high society persona. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You think you can play games with us? You think you can walk away from this without consequences? We are one of the most powerful families in Atlanta. I will spend every last dime I have to ruin your pathetic little life. I will drag your name through the mud until you cannot even find a job appraising cheap suburban houses." I looked down at her with absolute pity, marveling at how a woman who was drowning could still try to act like she owned the ocean. "You do not have any dimes left to spend, Vivian," I stated calmly, my voice cutting through her hysterical threats. And you really need to stop insulting my profession. You all thought I was just a struggling real estate appraiser trying to climb the social ladder by marrying your son. You thought Nana Pearl was just a poor, uneducated old woman who scrubbed floors and left me a worthless piece of dirt. You thought you could easily steal her 50-acre plot in South Fulton to save your fraudulent lifestyle. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the captivated audience of Atlanta elites. They were hanging on to my every word, recording the spectacular downfall of a woman who had looked down on them for decades. What none of you bothered to research. I continued, turning my full attention back to the trembling groom and his mother. Is that Nana Pearl's land sits dead center on the largest, most lucrative commercial zoning project currently underway in South Fulton. The city recently approved a multi-billion-dollar development plan that completely surrounds her property. That land is not a worthless piece of dirt. It is the most valuable commercial asset in the entire metropolitan area. Jasmine, who had been standing frozen near the bridesmaids, let out a loud gasp. She looked down at the fake cubic zirconia ring on her finger, perhaps finally realizing how badly she had been played. And I did not just inherit that land to sit on it. I declared, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. I am not a victim, and I am certainly not a charity case. I used that prime real estate as foundational capital. I used my grandmother's brilliant, quiet investment to build something massive. I used it to found Vanguard Holdings. The name dropped like a physical bomb in the middle of the chapel. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed from the pews. Several older businessmen in the crowd literally stood up from their seats in shock. Whispers erupted, instantly spreading like wildfire among the wealthy guests who suddenly realized they were witnessing financial history. Vivian staggered backward, her hands flying up to clutch the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, and her mouth opened and closed silently as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of my revelation. Everyone in the elite circles of Atlanta knew about Vanguard Holdings. They were the ruthless, faceless private equity firm that had been aggressively buying up commercial real estate, corporate debts, and luxury properties all over the city for the past 3 years. Vanguard was known for its predatory efficiency and its absolute lack of mercy. They were the apex predators of the Atlanta financial world, and nobody knew who actually ran the company. Until this exact second. Vanguard! Vivian gasped, the word barely escaping her throat. She looked at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a terrifying mythological creature. No, that is a lie. You cannot possibly be the owner of Vanguard Holdings. You are just a girl. You are just a working-class girl. I am the working-class girl who currently holds the deed to your entire life, I corrected her coldly. I turned my focus back to DeAndre. He looked completely shattered. The realization that he had attempted to con one of the most powerful financial figures in the city had finally clicked in his brain. He was shaking uncontrollably, his custom white tuxedo suddenly looking like a prison uniform. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. You thought you were a genius for hiding your $3 million debt, I said to him, pointing my finger directly at his chest. You thought you could trick me into marrying you, use my grandmother's land as collateral to pay off your lenders, and then throw me away. But while you were busy recording videos mocking my heritage at 5 o'clock this morning, I was making phone calls. DeAndre swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. What phone calls? He asked, his voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. I called my chief operating officer, I explained, relishing the absolute terror radiating from his body. I initiated a rapid asset acquisition protocol. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. And as of 11:30 this morning, exactly 30 minutes before I walked down this aisle, Vanguard officially bought out every single one of your commercial lenders. DeAndre's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the wooden podium to keep himself from collapsing onto the chapel floor. You bought my lenders, DeAndre repeated blindly, his brain short-circuiting as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. I bought everything, I confirmed, stepping right up to him. I leaned in close, making sure the microphone picked up every single syllable of my ultimate triumph. You tried to chain me to your financial ruin, but you severely underestimated who you were dealing with. I do not owe your debt, DeAndre. I own your debt. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The arrogant facade he had maintained for years was entirely gone, replaced by the sheer horror of a man recognizing his own demise. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There were no charming lies left to save him. There were no manipulative promises he could offer that would change the reality of his utter destruction. I stood tall, feeling the immense power of my grandmother's legacy coursing through my veins. The wealthy guests who had sneered at me earlier were now looking at me with undisguised fear and absolute respect. I was no longer the humble bride they thought they could easily step on. I was the architect of their financial nightmare. The sweet revenge I had carefully plotted since the crack of dawn was finally coming to fruition, and the devastating fallout was only just beginning to unfold before their very eyes. Every single thing they tried to steal from me was now the very weapon I was using to systematically dismantle their greedy, pathetic lives. I smiled, letting the silence stretch as my words permanently destroyed them. The silence hanging in the chapel was heavy and suffocating. DeAndre looked like he was about to pass out right there on the altar. But his mother was an entirely different breed of monster. Vivian was a woman who had spent her entire adult life ruling over Atlanta high society with an iron fist. She had built her entire identity on intimidation, manipulation, and an illusion of absolute supremacy. Admitting defeat to a woman she considered severely beneath her was physically impossible for her. Her initial shock quickly morphed into a feral, desperate, and unhinged rage. "You lying, delusional little rat!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking horribly as she stomped up the wooden altar steps. She shoved past her paralyzed son and stood right in front of me, her chest heaving with exertion. "Do you really think these sophisticated people believe a single word coming out of your pathetic mouth? You do not own Vanguard Holdings. You are a cheap working-class property appraiser who probably rented that wedding dress. You are standing in my church trying to ruin my son's beautiful wedding because you are bitter, jealous, and severely mentally unstable." Vivian turned wildly toward the stunned congregation, waving her arms in a frantic motion. "Do not listen to her. She is having a psychotic break. She forged those videos and she is lying about this company. She is a fraud trying to extort us." She spun back to me, her eyes looking completely manic and unhinged. "Security! Get in here right now. I want this deranged woman escorted off my property immediately. Throw her out into the dirty street where she belongs." The two large security guards positioned near the heavy chapel doors exchanged uneasy glances. They shifted their weight, but did not take a single step forward to assist her. They were technically employed by the venue, and the venue management had received a very specific, legally binding memo early this morning regarding the abrupt change in corporate ownership. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at Vivian with utter, unapologetic disdain. "You really do not know when to fold a losing hand, do you, Vivian?" From the very first row of the polished pews, a tall, impeccably dressed man stood up. Xavier smoothed the front of his tailored charcoal suit. He radiated a calm, lethal, and absolute professionalism. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase in his right hand. The whispering crowd parted instinctively as he stepped out into the center aisle and walked with unhurried, dominant purpose toward the front altar. Vivian glared at him, her chest still heaving rapidly. "Who the hell are you? I said get security in here right now to remove this crazy woman." Xavier ignored her completely until he reached the top of the altar steps. He stood firmly beside me, unlatching his briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap that commanded immediate attention. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound by a sturdy blue clip. He extended his right hand, offering the terrifying papers directly to Vivian. "My name is Xavier," he introduced himself, his voice remarkably smooth and carrying effortlessly across the totally silent room. "I am the Chief Operating Officer and the lead legal counsel for Vanguard Holdings, and I highly suggest you take these documents and read them, Vivian." Vivian stared at the offered papers as if they were covered in deadly poison. Her manicured hands trembled violently, but her stubborn pride refused to let her back down in front of her elite peers. She angrily snatched the documents from Xavier's hand. "What is this garbage?" she spat viciously. though her voice lacked its earlier commanding volume. Xavier adjusted his silver cufflinks, his expression remaining completely blank and professional. Those are the certified, legally binding records of your immediate financial ruin. Vivian, your massive Buckhead mansion has been in severe mortgage default for 90 consecutive days. You have been taking out secret high-interest loans against that property for the last 5 years just to maintain your fake rich lifestyle. You have been financing your expensive country club dues, your luxury cars, and your designer gowns entirely on credit you absolutely cannot afford to repay. A collective dramatic gasp ripped through the crowded chapel. The hushed murmurs erupted instantly into loud, scandalous conversations. Xavier continued, his voice relentless and sharp. The bank was preparing to officially seize your home next week. However, Vanguard Holdings bought your mortgage and all your associated personal debt portfolios this morning. We are now your sole legal creditors. You are officially in foreclosure today. All of your bank accounts are entirely frozen. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property before the authorities remove you. The color completely drained from Vivian's face. The thick stack of paper in her hands shook so violently she could barely hold it. Her wide, terrified eyes darted back and forth across the dense legal jargon, the official bank seals, and the indisputable negative numbers that proved she was entirely and hopelessly bankrupt. The elite guests sitting in the wooden pews were no longer just whispering quietly to each other. They were openly reacting to the spectacular drama. The very people Vivian had spent decades trying to impress and control were now eagerly pointing their cell phones at her, recording every agonizing second of her massive downfall. I watched closely as her supposed best friends, the wealthy women she had loudly gossiped with during the cocktail hour, looked at her with pure disgust, mockery, and intense pity. "She is completely broke," a wealthy woman wearing a large yellow hat whispered loudly from the second row, making sure her voice carried. "She has been lying to us this whole time. Her entire life is a massive scam." Generational wealth. Another older businessman scoffed, shaking his head in total disbelief. "She is a complete fraud. They are completely destitute." The flawless facade was entirely destroyed. The legendary myth of the mighty untouchable legacy family was brutally exposed as a rotting mountain of fraudulent unpaid debt. Vivian looked out at her judgmental friends. She saw the dozens of cell phone cameras recording her ultimate humiliation. She saw the cruel sneers on the faces of the people she used to rule over with intimidation. She opened her mouth to fiercely defend herself, to shout another ridiculous lie, to demand their unwavering respect. But she had absolutely nothing left to say. Her throat was completely dry. Her shaking knees simply buckled beneath her weight. Vivian collapsed heavily onto the hard wooden floor of the altar. She dropped the thick stack of foreclosure documents, the white papers scattering messily across the pristine white aisle runner. She gripped her expensive pearl necklace, gasping loudly for air as a genuine, terrifying panic attack took over her entire body. The once untouchable, arrogant matriarch was brutally reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess on the floor of her own ruined, incredibly expensive event. DeAndre remained frozen beside her, staring blankly down at the scattered legal papers. His mind was entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of his failure. He could not kneel down to comfort his weeping mother. He could not find the strength to fight me. He was a hollow, defeated shell of a man who had just lost absolutely everything he ever cared about. I looked down at the two of them, feeling absolutely no remorse in my heart. They had happily planned to destroy my life without a single second thought. They had enthusiastically planned to strip me of my grandmother's hard-earned land and purposely leave me drowning with $3 million of their criminal business debt. I was simply delivering the exact devastating consequence they had so greedily ordered for me. While Vivian wept pathetically on the floor and DeAndre stared blindly into the dark void, a sudden nervous movement caught the corner of my eye. Down in the front pew, Jasmine was heavily panicking. The deeply entitled young woman who had haughtily marched into my private bridal suite and demanded my grandmother's jewelry was suddenly realizing that her entire fabricated reality was collapsing rapidly. If her mother was officially bankrupt and her older brother was drowning in federal debt, her luxurious, heavily curated influencer lifestyle was completely and permanently over. There would be no more free designer bags, no more exotic island vacations paid for by the family business, and absolutely no more pretending to be a wealthy Atlanta heiress online. Jasmine clutched her expensive silk gown tightly, her wide eyes darting nervously toward the side exit of the chapel. She pulled her phone from her designer purse, typing frantically, her face pale with absolute terror. She began to inch her way out of the wooden pew, desperately trying to use the chaotic murmurs and shifting bodies of the distracted crowd to cover her quiet escape. She kept her head down, hoping she could just slip away before the massive blast radius reached her directly. She took one careful step toward the heavy side door, then another, sheer desperation fueling her quiet retreat. I was not going to let a single one of them escape the harsh consequences of their immense arrogance today. They had all participated in the cruel plot, and they would all face the music together. I raised the heavy microphone back to my lips. My voice echoed sharply over the sounds of Vivian's loud sobbing and the crowd's relentless gossip, cutting through the chaotic noise like a perfectly aimed blade. I stared right at the fleeing bridesmaid. "Leaving so soon, Jasmine?" Jasmine froze mid-step. Her manicured hand was still tightly wrapped around the heavy brass handle of the chapel's side door. The entire congregation, which had just been staring in absolute horror at Vivian, sobbing on the floor, turned their collective attention toward the fleeing bridesmaid. Jasmine realized she was caught. She slowly turned her head to look back over her shoulder, her face completely drained of color. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, cornered panic. "I was just going to call an ambulance for my mother," Jasmine stammered, her voice shaking violently. "She is clearly having a severe medical emergency. Someone needs to help her right now." "You were not pulling out your phone to call an ambulance, Jasmine," I said calmly, stepping away from the altar and walking slowly down the first few steps toward the center aisle. "You were opening your rideshare application because you already know exactly what is currently happening in the VIP parking courtyard. You were trying to escape before the rest of your fake, highly curated influencer life was publicly exposed to everyone in this room." I looked at the crowd of Atlanta socialites, many of whom actively followed Jasmine on social media. She had built a massive online following by aggressively flaunting a lifestyle she absolutely could not afford. She posted daily photos of herself holding designer shopping bags, dining at five-star restaurants, and posing in front of luxury vehicles. She frequently posted arrogant videos giving financial advice and preaching about the importance of generational wealth, acting as if she had earned every single luxury through her own brilliant entrepreneurial grind. In reality, she was entirely funded by her brother's fraudulent business loans and a towering stack of maxed-out credit cards. The chapel we were standing in featured massive floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows along the back wall, but the side doors were made of clear, heavy glass that looked directly out onto the venue's exclusive VIP parking courtyard. Suddenly, a loud, heavy mechanical grinding noise echoed from the courtyard outside. The harsh sound of grinding gears and a heavy diesel engine cut sharply through the quiet, tense atmosphere of the chapel. Every single guest sitting on the left side of the aisle immediately turned their heads to look out through the clear glass doors. A massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck was aggressively backing up into the pristine, brick-paved parking area. The bright yellow warning lights on top of the truck flashed brightly, casting a rhythmic, harsh glare through the chapel windows. The tow truck driver, a large man wearing a neon safety vest, hopped out of his cab. He walked directly toward a matte black Lamborghini Urus. It was Jasmine's prized possession. It was the exact luxury vehicle she used as the central prop for her entire online aesthetic. She claimed she bought it in cash after a highly successful investment quarter. "No," Jasmine gasped, dropping her designer clutch onto the floor. "No, you cannot do this. Stop him right now." I held the microphone up, ensuring my voice remained the dominant force in the room. "Jasmine, you have not made a single car payment in 6 consecutive months. You have been actively dodging the repossession agents by hiding that vehicle in secure gated garages across the city. But you brought it out today because you wanted to show off for the wedding guests. You thought you were untouchable." Jasmine slammed her hands against the heavy glass doors, screaming at the tow truck driver outside. But the thick glass muffled her frantic screams, and the driver completely ignored her. He efficiently secured the heavy metal winch to the front axle of the matte black luxury vehicle. When Vanguard Holdings began aggressively acquiring distressed assets in the Atlanta metropolitan area, we purchased massive blocks of delinquent auto loans from desperate lenders, I explained to the captivated crowd. When my team reviewed the newly acquired portfolio, your name was sitting right at the very top of the severely delinquent list. Vanguard owns the title to that vehicle now. Say goodbye to your flawless aesthetic, Jasmine. The guests in the pews were absolutely relentless. They held their phones high, recording Jasmine pounding her fists desperately against the glass doors as the tow truck hydraulically lifted the front end of her beloved Lamborghini off the ground. The vehicle she used to make thousands of other women feel inadequate was now dangling from a metal hook, being repossessed in broad daylight in front of 300 elite witnesses. Jasmine spun around, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage and humiliation. Tears of absolute fury streamed down her cheeks, completely ruining her professional makeup. She looked like a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy permanently confiscated. She stomped away from the glass doors and marched back toward the center aisle, glaring at me with a venomous intensity. She was desperately searching for any possible way to salvage her shattered pride. She needed to score a hit against me to prove she was not entirely defeated. Jasmine suddenly raised her right hand high into the air. She extended her index finger proudly, showcasing the massive sparkling green stones surrounded by a halo of diamonds. It was the ring she had aggressively bullied me into handing over in the bridal suite just a few short hours ago. "You think you have completely ruined me!" Jasmine screamed, her voice echoing shrilly through the chapel. "I do not care about a stupid car. Vehicles can be replaced. But at least I still have this. You are actually stupid enough to let me take your precious grandmother's antique jewelry. This vintage emerald ring is worth at least $50,000. I am going to walk right out of this venue, go straight to a premium pawn shop, and I'm going to sell your dead grandmother's most prized possession to buy myself a brand new car in cash. You played yourself, Aaliyah. You gave me the exact financial leverage I need to recover from this." She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile, fully believing she had just delivered a devastating emotional blow to my heart. She thought she was holding my family's sacred legacy hostage. I looked at her raised hand. I looked at the green stone catching the light of the chapel chandeliers. And then I let out another deep, genuine, and completely unbothered laugh. My laughter echoed warmly through the room, completely stripping away the tension she had tried so desperately to create. "Jasmine," I said, shaking my head with a mixture of amusement and profound pity, "do you honestly believe I would bring a priceless, irreplaceable family heirloom anywhere near a family of known thieves and calculating fraudsters? Do you really think I would let a spoiled, entitled bully like you intimidate me into handing over the only physical item I have left of Nana Pearl?" Jasmine's victorious smile faltered. Her hand dropped slightly as a seed of genuine doubt began to plant itself in her mind. She looked down at the ring, then back up at me, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Take it to a jeweler," I challenged her confidently. "Please, I highly insist that you take it to the best appraiser in the city. Let them examine the clarity of the stone. But I can save you the trip and the massive humiliation. It is not an emerald, Jasmine. It is a piece of colored glass and cubic zirconia." Jasmine gasped, her mouth falling open in shock. She quickly pulled the ring off her finger and stared at it closely, holding it up to the light. "I bought that cheap replica on Amazon for exactly $40 with free overnight shipping," I revealed smoothly. "I ordered it specifically for you to steal today. I knew your mother would find some ridiculous reason to insult my heritage, and I knew you would be greedy enough to demand something that did not belong to you. The real ring, the actual priceless emerald that Nana Pearl gave me, is currently sitting safely inside a climate-controlled, heavily guarded security vault at Vanguard Holdings headquarters." I paused, letting the reality of her extreme foolishness sink deep into her brain. "You just proudly and publicly confessed to stealing a piece of cheap costume jewelry, Jasmine. You thought you were holding my heart hostage, but you are literally holding $40 worth of factory-made glass." The crowd erupted into immediate mocking laughter. The wealthy socialites who had previously tolerated Jasmine's arrogant online presence were now openly pointing and laughing at her profound stupidity. She had bragged about stealing a priceless heirloom only to be publicly exposed as a petty thief holding a worthless trinket. Jasmine looked around the room, her eyes wide with total devastation. The mocking laughter of her peers surrounded her on all sides. She had absolutely nothing left. She had no luxury car, no money, no valuable jewelry, and absolutely no social standing. She realized that she was just as ruined as her mother and her brother. Overwhelmed by the sheer embarrassment and the total collapse of her fake reality, Jasmine sank to her knees right there in the aisle, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. The majestic legacy family of Buckhead had been completely dismantled. Vivian was weeping uncontrollably near the altar. DeAndre was standing frozen in shock, staring blankly at the floor. Jasmine was sobbing in the aisle, clutching a $40 fake ring. I had successfully neutralized every single threat they posed to my grandmother's land and my own financial future. But there was still one loose end remaining. There was still one rat desperately trying to flee a rapidly sinking ship. I shifted my gaze away from the crying family and looked toward the back of the chapel. While everyone was entirely distracted by Jasmine's spectacular meltdown over the tow truck and the fake ring, Chloe had quietly stepped out of her pew. The woman who had proudly worn a white silk gown to my wedding, the woman who had sat on my fiancé's lap at 5 o'clock this morning, was currently trying to make a silent, unnoticed exit. Chloe was keeping her head down, her blonde hair falling over her face as she shuffled quickly down the center aisle. She was trying to blend in with the surrounding floral arrangements, hoping the chaotic distraction at the front of the room would allow her to slip out the main doors and disappear into the Atlanta afternoon. She thought she had successfully dodged the massive crossfire. She thought the devastating consequences were only reserved for DeAndre and his immediate family members. She fully believed she could just walk away completely unscathed and find another wealthy man to attach herself to. I gripped the microphone tightly. I was not going to let a single participant in this cruel scheme walk away without facing complete accountability. Not so fast, Chloe. My voice boomed through the speakers, instantly halting her in her tracks just a few feet away from the heavy wooden exit doors. Did you really think you were just the side piece? Not so fast, Chloe. My voice boomed through the speakers, instantly halting her in her tracks just a few feet away from the heavy wooden exit doors. Did you really think you were just the side piece? Chloe froze completely, her hand hovering inches away from the brass push bar of the exit. The entire chapel, which had been buzzing with the chaotic aftermath of Vivian's collapse and Jasmine's public humiliation, suddenly fell, pin drop silent once again. 300 pairs of eyes shifted their intense judgmental focus away from the crying bridesmaids and the weeping matriarch, landing squarely on the woman in the white silk gown. Chloe slowly turned around to face me. The smug, victorious smirk she had worn proudly since she strutted into the VIP cocktail hour was completely gone. Her perfectly contoured face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously around the massive room. She suddenly realized that the protective bubble of DeAndre's arrogant confidence had burst, leaving her completely exposed to the crossfire. I do not know what you are talking about, Chloe stammered, her voice trembling as she clutched her designer purse tightly against her chest. She took a cautious step backward, pressing her spine against the heavy wooden door. I did not have anything to do with their financial problems. I did not know DeAndre was bankrupt. I just came here today because he loves me. I am just his girlfriend. This family drama has absolutely nothing to do with me. Let me leave. Oh, you are much more than just a girlfriend, Chloe, I said smoothly, stepping off the final altar step and walking slowly down the pristine white aisle runner. You played a very critical role in this entire operation, and you are not going to sneak out that door until everyone in this room understands exactly how valuable you were to your beloved DeAndre. I stopped a few feet away from her, letting the heavy, agonizing silence stretch through the chapel. DeAndre was still standing near the altar, looking like a man who was watching his own execution in slow motion. He knew exactly what I was about to reveal, and the sheer terror radiating from his body was absolutely intoxicating. When Vanguard Holdings acquired the commercial debt portfolios from DeAndre's lenders, I did not just look at the outstanding balances. I explained to the captivated crowd, keeping my gaze locked sharply on Chloe. My team and I conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of the loan origination documents. We dug deep into the paperwork to see exactly how a man with no actual liquid assets managed to secure a $3 million business loan in the first place. Chloe blinked, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. She clearly did not understand corporate finance, nor did she comprehend why I was explaining this to her. You see, I continued pacing slowly in front of her. DeAndre's personal credit score was absolute garbage. He was highly overleveraged, maxed out on a dozen credit cards, and his logistics company was bleeding cash every single quarter. No reputable bank in the state of Georgia would have ever approved a $3 million commercial loan based on his failing business metrics alone. The risk assessment algorithm would have rejected his application in less than 5 seconds. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the sweating, trembling groom standing helplessly at the front of the room. DeAndre needed a co-signer, I declared, my voice echoing powerfully through the sound system. He needed a corporate guarantor with a pristine financial record, a clean background, and a high enough credit score to convince the underwriters that the massive loan was fully secured. He needed a naive, trusting fool to legally attach their name to his highly fraudulent business ventures. Isn't that right, Chloe? Chloe's breath hitched. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking as white as the inappropriate silk gown she was wearing. She shook her head rapidly, her eyes widening with a sudden dawning horror. No, Chloe gasped, her voice barely a whisper. No, I never signed any commercial loan documents. I never co-signed anything for his company. We just dated. I just let him stay at my apartment sometimes. I do not have $3 million. I know you never actually signed those documents, Chloe, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, lethal register. But your signature is definitely on them. Your social security number, your bank account information, your pristine credit history. It is all printed clearly on the final execution pages of the commercial loan agreements that are currently sitting in my secure corporate office. A sharp collective gasp ripped through the chapel. The wealthy guests leaned forward, completely mesmerized by the escalating destruction. Chloe turned her head slowly, looking past me toward the altar. She stared at DeAndre, her eyes wide with total devastation. The man she thought loved her unconditionally, the man who had kissed her this morning and promised to leave me for her, had used her identity to secure his financial survival. DeAndre, Chloe cried out, her voice cracking with raw, agonizing betrayal. What did you do? Tell her she is lying. Tell her you did not use my name. DeAndre could not look her in the eye. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, his hands shaking violently at his sides. He swallowed hard, completely unable to utter a single word of defense. His cowardly silence was a full, damning confession. He did not just lose that $3 million, Chloe, I explained, delivering the final crushing blow. He committed federal wire fraud to obtain those loans. He fabricated revenue reports, he forged corporate tax returns, and he deliberately forged your signature as the primary corporate guarantor. You were never just his beloved mistress. You were his unwitting financial shield. He used your clean record to secure the bag, fully intending to leave you holding the bag when his fake company inevitably collapsed. Chloe let out a gut-wrenching sob. Her knees buckled and she slid down the heavy wooden door, collapsing onto the chapel floor in a heap of white silk and profound despair. She buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly as the horrifying reality of her situation completely settled in. By eagerly participating in his cruel scheme to humiliate and destroy me, Chloe had unknowingly tied herself to a massive federal crime. She had gloated in the sunroom at 5 o'clock this morning, laughing at my expense, entirely unaware that DeAndre had already sold her financial future down the river. She thought she was securing a wealthy, handsome husband by being the ultimate loyal side piece. Instead, she had legally bound herself to a $3 million fraudulent deficit. You ruined my life! Chloe screamed at DeAndre through her tears, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. I trusted you. I loved you. You told me we were going to build a life together. I am sorry, Chloe. DeAndre finally croaked, his voice cracking pitifully. I was going to fix it. I just needed Aaliyah's land to clear the accounts. I was going to protect you. I swear I was going to fix it today. You were never going to fix anything, DeAndre, I stated firmly, cutting off his pathetic excuses. You are a parasite. You leech off the hard work and the pristine credit of the women around you because you are completely incapable of building anything real on your own. You tried to steal my grandmother's legacy to cover up your massive failures, and you actively destroyed the life of the woman you claimed to love just to buy yourself a few more months of pretending to be rich. I looked around the room, taking in the absolute carnage I had successfully orchestrated. Vivian was still hyperventilating near the front row, completely shattered by her sudden eviction and bankruptcy. Jasmine was crying over her repossessed Lamborghini and her fake $40 cubic zirconia ring. Chloe was sobbing on the floor by the exit, facing total financial ruin and severe legal consequences for crimes she did not even commit. And DeAndre was standing at the altar, publicly exposed as a manipulative, broke, and entirely cowardly fraud. The majestic legacy family of Buckhead had been systematically and ruthlessly dismantled. I had neutralized every single threat they posed, turning their own greed and arrogance into the very weapons that destroyed them. I felt a deep, powerful surge of satisfaction warming my chest. Nana Pearl would have been incredibly proud of how I handled her sacred legacy. But the absolute climax of my sweet revenge was not quite finished yet. The financial ruin was only the civil consequence of their disgusting actions. I had promised to hold DeAndre fully accountable for every single secret he thought he had buried in the dark, and that included the criminal actions he took to secure those fraudulent loans. I stood silently in the middle of the aisle, watching the elite guests frantically whisper and record the incredible spectacle. The heavy, dramatic atmosphere of the chapel was suddenly pierced by a new, distinct sound coming from outside the venue's thick walls. A faint, high-pitched wailing noise drifted through the heavy wooden doors. I smiled, keeping my eyes locked on DeAndre's terrified face. The sound grew steadily louder, cutting sharply through the sounds of Vivian's and Chloe's relentless sobbing. The distant wail quickly multiplied, transforming into a chaotic, overlapping chorus of blaring sirens rapidly approaching the grand Piedmont estate. The heavy stained glass windows lining the back of the beautiful chapel suddenly illuminated with bright rhythmic flashes of color. The violent alternating bursts of bright blue and sharp red light danced aggressively across the dark wooden pews, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and casting eerie moving shadows across the terrified faces of the wedding guests. The sirens grew deafeningly loud, vibrating through the solid floorboards, as multiple heavy vehicles aggressively screeched to a halt right outside the chapel's main entrance. The wooden doors of the chapel swung open with a resounding crash. A squad of Atlanta Police Department officers, accompanied by two federal agents wearing tactical jackets, marched into the venue with absolute authority. The heavy thud of their tactical boots against the polished floor echoed through the silent room. They moved in a synchronized formation, scanning the terrified crowd of wealthy socialites before locking directly onto the altar. Panic instantly swept through the pews. The affluent guests, who moments ago had been greedily recording the scandalous family drama on their smartphones, shrank back very quickly. They pressed into their seats in genuine fear. Women clutched their designer handbags tightly to their chests, and men nervously adjusted their silk ties. The flashing blue and red lights from the cruisers parked outside continued to pulse aggressively through the stained glass windows, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the entire chapel. DeAndre stumbled backward, his knees visibly shaking as the officers marched straight down the center aisle. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. The charming, arrogant facade he had worn his entire life was completely permanently gone. In its place stood a terrified, broken fraud who finally realized he was out of time and out of options. Xavier stepped forward from his position near the front pew, smoothing his tailored suit jacket with calm precision. He walked confidently to meet the lead federal agent halfway down the aisle. They exchanged a brief professional nod. Xavier reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, handing it directly to the agent. "Here is the final confirmation packet," Xavier stated, his voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the frightened congregation. "As discussed earlier this week, Vanguard Holdings has compiled and submitted the complete forensic audit of DeAndre's logistics firm. The folder contains the verified bank routing numbers, the forged loan origination documents, and the irrefutable proof of his serial embezzlement over the last 4 fiscal quarters. We have thoroughly documented every single instance of wire fraud he committed to secure those massive commercial loans. The lead agent took the folder, flipping it open to briefly verify the contents. He nodded again, his expression entirely grim. Thank you, counselor. The Financial Crimes Division appreciates your extensive cooperation in this matter. We already secured the federal warrants based on the digital evidence your corporate team surrendered 3 days ago. This physical documentation simply ties up the remaining loose ends. DeAndre let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. His eyes darted wildly between me, Xavier, and the approaching officers. He finally realized the true devastating extent of my revenge. I had not just planned to humiliate him in front of his elite peers. I had not just planned to wipe out his finances by purchasing his massive debts. I had systematically orchestrated his complete loss of freedom. I had deliberately timed the conclusion of our corporate forensic financial audit to perfectly align with his wedding day. Answering his federal arrest warrant would be executed right here at the altar in front of 300 witnesses. The officers bypassed Chloe, who was still sobbing uncontrollably on the floor near the side exit, entirely paralyzed by the realization that her forged signature was featured heavily in that manila folder. They marched straight up the wooden steps of the altar and surrounded the groom. DeAndre, the lead federal agent barked, his voice projecting unquestionable authority. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe corporate embezzlement. Place your hands behind your back immediately. The words hit DeAndre like a physical blow. His legs completely gave out. The man who had proudly boasted about stealing my grandmother's land just hours ago collapsed heavily onto his knees. He looked up at the officers with wide, terrified eyes, shaking his head rapidly in absolute denial. No, DeAndre pleaded, his voice cracking pitifully. No, this is a mistake. You cannot do this today. This is my wedding day. I am getting married. He scrambled forward on his knees, completely ignoring the officers commanding him to stop moving right now. He grabbed the heavy silk fabric of my wedding gown, his hands shaking violently as he looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. The arrogant, wealthy businessman persona was entirely stripped away, leaving only a desperate, cowardly boy begging for his life. Baby, please! DeAndre cried out, his voice high-pitched and frantic. Please, Aaliyah, we love each other. We are supposed to build a life together. You can stop this. You are the chief executive officer of Vanguard. You own the debt. Now you can just pay it all off. You have the massive money to make this entirely go away. He tightened his grip on my dress, sobbing loudly. Please do not let them take me to prison. I will do whatever you want. I will sign any contract you put in front of me. I will be the perfect husband. Just tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you forgive the debt. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling at my feet. The man who had sneered at my working-class background. The man who had plotted to leave me destitute while he laughed with his mistress. I felt absolutely zero pity for him. The emotional detachment I had maintained all morning solidified into a cold, unbreakable steel. I smoothly reached down and peeled his sweating, trembling hands off the expensive silk fabric of my gown. I took a deliberate step back, putting physical and emotional distance between myself and his toxic desperation. You really do not understand anything about real power, do you? I asked, my voice dangerously soft but amplified perfectly by the microphone I still held in my left hand. You thought you could build an empire on a foundation of lies, stolen identities, and predatory commercial loans. You thought you could trick a woman into financing your failures while you mocked her heritage behind closed doors. I looked at him with profound, utter disgust. Generational wealth is not built on fraud. DeAndre, I declared firmly, ensuring every single guest in the chapel heard the final devastating truth. It is built on hard work. It is built on grit. It is built on the sweat of women like my grandmother, who scrubbed floors so her family could thrive legitimately. You tried to steal her legacy because you were too weak and too incompetent to build your own. I signaled to the federal agents with a slight nod of my head. Enjoy federal prison, I said coldly. The officers immediately lunged forward. They grabbed DeAndre roughly by the arms and hauled him forcefully to his feet. He thrashed and kicked, screaming my name over and over again, but his desperate resistance was completely futile against the highly trained agents. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around DeAndre's wrists echoed loudly through the silent chapel. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the undeniable sound of total victory and permanent justice. "Alia, please do not do this to me," DeAndre wailed as the officers began dragging him forcefully down the center aisle. He dragged his expensive Italian leather shoes across the white runner, ruining the pristine fabric. The wealthy guests physically shrank back into their pews as the disgraced groom was paraded past them in handcuffs. The socialites who had cheered for him an hour ago now looked at him with sheer, unadulterated revulsion. I watched him being hauled out the front doors, the flashing police lights illuminating his tear-stained, horrified face one last time before the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. The chapel fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer magnitude of the destruction was almost too much for the crowd to process. In less than 20 minutes, the entire fake empire of the most arrogant family in Atlanta had been brutally and systematically annihilated. Jasmine was ruined and carless. Chloe was legally implicated in massive federal crimes. DeAndre was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser in handcuffs, facing decades in federal prison. There was only one loose end remaining on the battlefield. A soft, pathetic whimpering sound quickly drew my immediate attention back to the front of the altar. Vivian, the haughty matriarch who had spent her morning making passive-aggressive jabs about my upbringing, was still sitting on the floor where she had collapsed earlier. The undeniable reality of her total destruction had completely broken her mind. Her pristine silver gown was tangled and wrinkled. Her perfectly styled hair hung in messy clumps around her tear-streaked face. Vivian, completely broken and defeated, slowly crawls toward me, desperately grabbing the delicate hem of my expensive wedding dress, weeping uncontrollably and aggressively begging me for absolute complete mercy today. I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman clutching the heavy silk of my wedding gown. Vivian, the formerly untouchable queen of Buckhead society, was completely broken. Her expensive silver dress was crumpled against the cold floor of the altar. Her perfectly styled hair was a wild, tangled mess around her tear-stained face. She gripped the fabric of my dress with shaking hands, burying her face against my knees as she sobbed loudly. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, suffocating terror. She finally realized that she was entirely at my mercy, and she was desperately begging for a salvation she absolutely did not deserve. "Alia, please!" Vivian wailed, her voice cracking as she looked up at me with dark mascara running down her cheeks. "Please do not do this to us. I am begging you. Take the house, take the cars, take everything Vanguard Holdings acquired, but please let my son go. Please tell the federal agents to release DeAndre. I will do whatever you want. I will get on my knees and apologize to you in front of the entire city. Just please show us some grace today." I stared down at her trembling face. I felt the collective gaze of 300 elite guests burning into my back, watching to see if my heart would soften. They were waiting to see if the working-class girl would show mercy to the fallen matriarch. But I had absolutely zero mercy left to give. My heart was a fortress of solid ice. I reached down and firmly pried her desperate manicured fingers off the pristine fabric of my gown. I took a deliberate step backward, completely untangling myself from her toxic grasp. Grace is reserved for people who accidentally make mistakes. "Vivian," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the chapel speakers. "You did not make a mistake. You meticulously planned to destroy my life. You happily celebrated my impending financial ruin just a few hours ago while drinking champagne in your sunroom. You looked me right in the eyes during the cocktail hour and tried to humiliate me in front of all your wealthy friends." Vivian shook her head rapidly, choking on her own tears. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. Please, Aaliyah. We are family now. We are absolutely nothing to each other." I snapped, my voice rising with undeniable authority. "You called my grandmother an uneducated sweet woman. You mocked her because she scrubbed floors for a living. You thought her life was a joke because she did not have your prestigious social standing or your country club memberships. But let me tell you something about my grandmother. My grandmother scrubbed those floors until her hands bled so I could go to college without taking on a single dime of debt. She bought land in South Fulton when absolutely nobody else wanted it, holding on to it with unmatched vision and grit. She built real tangible wealth while you built a fragile house of cards financed entirely by lies, predatory loans, and sheer arrogance. I paced slowly across the altar, making sure my words carried to the very back of the massive chapel. Every single guest was hanging onto my speech. You looked down on me because I did not have your fake pedigree. I continued, pointing a sharp finger down at the sobbing woman. You thought my lack of a legacy last name made me an easy target for your financial crimes. You paraded your son's mistress around my wedding reception just to break my spirit. But your pedigree is a complete illusion. Your entire life is a heavily financed lie. And now the working-class girl you tried to exploit is the exact person holding the legal deed to your entire existence. Vivian let out a guttural, agonizing wail. She collapsed fully onto the floor, burying her face in her arms as the absolute reality of her permanent destruction settled over her. She had nothing left to say. There were no more lies she could spin to save her ruined reputation. The high society peers she had spent decades trying to impress were currently staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Her elite friends were already whispering about how quickly they needed to distance themselves from her toxic, bankrupt family. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the floor. I looked toward the side of the chapel where my highly trained private security team was standing quietly in the shadows. I caught the eye of my lead security director, a towering, heavily muscled man wearing a crisp black suit and a secure earpiece. I gave him a single sharp nod. "Get them out of my venue," I commanded smoothly. The security team moved with terrifying absolute efficiency. 4 massive guards stepped out of the shadows and marched purposefully toward the altar. They completely bypassed the stunned wedding guests and surrounded the ruined matriarch. 2 guards reached down and grabbed Vivian firmly by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. She shrieked loudly, her legs completely giving out as they dragged her across the polished wooden floor. "No!" Vivian screamed, thrashing wildly against their iron grips. "Get your hands off me! I am a respected member of this community. You cannot treat me like a common criminal. You are a trespasser on private corporate property," the lead security guard stated flatly, completely ignoring her hysterical protests. "Move." As Vivian was forcefully dragged down the center aisle, her silver gown bunching up around her knees, she passed right by Jasmine. DeAndre's sister was still kneeling near the pews, completely paralyzed by the loss of her repossessed luxury car and the exposure of her fake diamond ring. Jasmine looked up at her mother in total absolute horror. 2 other security guards stepped toward the crying bridesmaid. Jasmine did not even try to put up a fight. The aggressive, entitled bully who had stormed into my bridal suite earlier today was completely broken. She meekly allowed the guards to grab her arms, her head hanging low in ultimate defeat as they escorted her away from the altar. The elite crowd watched in dead silence as the 2 women were marched down the long white runner. Vivian continued to scream and sob, hurling pathetic, empty threats at anyone who would listen. But nobody intervened. Nobody stood up to defend them. The wealthy socialites simply pulled their expensive dresses closer to their bodies, desperately trying to avoid any physical contact with the disgraced family as they were paraded out of the chapel. They trailed directly behind the path where DeAndre had just been dragged out in federal handcuffs moments earlier. The entire family, once the proud, arrogant rulers of Atlanta's high society, was officially banished from their own lavish event. They were violently expelled into the harsh daylight, completely stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their highly protected social standing. The heavy oak doors of the chapel slammed shut behind them, with a loud, satisfying boom, permanently sealing them outside in their new miserable reality. The silence inside the grand chapel was incredibly thick and heavy. 300 guests sat frozen in their seats, staring blankly at the empty altar. The sheer magnitude of the explosive drama they had just witnessed had left them entirely speechless. They had arrived expecting a traditional, boring society wedding. Instead, they had received a front-row ticket to a ruthless, masterful corporate execution. I stood alone at the front of the room. The toxic energy that had previously suffocated the venue was completely gone, sucked out through the heavy doors, along with DeAndre and his awful family. I felt an immense, overwhelming wave of profound peace wash over my entire body. The heavy burden I had carried since 5 o'clock this morning vanished entirely. The trap had worked flawlessly. Every single piece of my intricate revenge plan had fallen perfectly into place. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet scent of the floral arrangements surrounding the altar. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to absorb the incredible magnitude of my victory. I had successfully protected Nana Pearl's legacy. I had defended my corporate empire. I ensured the predators who tried to consume my life were locked away in cages of their own making. I opened my eyes and smoothed my hands down the front of my expensive silk wedding dress. I adjusted my posture, ensuring my shoulders were pulled back and my spine was perfectly straight. I felt incredibly powerful, untouchable, and completely free. I turned away from the massive projection screens. I walked down the altar steps, my heels clicking sharply against the wooden floorboards. I stopped right at the edge of the first row of pews, standing confidently. A genuine warm smile spread across my face. "Now that the trash has been taken out," I said softly, "who is ready for a real party?" For a brief moment, the 300 elite guests simply stared at me in total silence. They were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the corporate execution they had just witnessed. Then a single sharp laugh echoed from the back of the chapel. It was Xavier. He stood near the entrance, clapping his hands together with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound broke the suffocating spell that had gripped the room. I reached up and unpinned the heavy, restrictive bridal veil from my hair. I pulled the delicate white lace away from my face, feeling the sudden, refreshing rush of cool air against my skin. I tossed the expensive veil carelessly onto the floor of the altar, letting it land right where Vivian had collapsed just moments before. I did not need to wear the costume of a submissive bride anymore. I was fully myself again. I looked toward the sound booth and gave the audiovisual technician a final triumphant nod. The technician grinned broadly, flashing a thumbs up. He pressed a button on his mixing board. The somber traditional string quartet music was instantly cut off. In its place, the heavy, unmistakable bass of a celebratory Atlanta hip-hop anthem blasted through the venue's premium surround sound system. The energetic, thumping beat instantly transformed the stuffy, tense chapel into an exclusive high-end lounge. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open once again. A highly coordinated army of professional caterers marched down the aisles. They carried massive silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of premium vintage champagne. They moved efficiently among the wooden pews, offering the expensive drinks to the bewildered but increasingly excited guests. The wealthy socialites who had spent the entire morning expecting a boring, predictable ceremony eagerly grabbed the glasses. The initial shock was rapidly fading, replaced by the thrilling realization that they were currently attending the most legendary event in modern Atlanta history. I stepped away from the altar and walked gracefully down the center aisle, moving to the beat of the music. The guests parted for me, their eyes filled with deep, undeniable respect. I was no longer the working-class girl they could whisper about. I was the absolute master of the room. I reached a small, elevated staging area that had been set up near the center of the venue for the reception. I grabbed a fresh microphone from a stand, the sleek metal cool against my palm. The guests immediately quieted down, turning their full attention toward me, eager to hear my next command. "Thank you all for coming today," I announced, my voice carrying warm and bright over the pulsing music. "I know many of you cleared your busy schedules to attend a high society wedding. But I must confess, today was never actually going to be a wedding. That was simply the necessary cover story to get all the right people in the exact same room." The crowd let out a collective appreciative murmur. They raised their champagne glasses, completely captivated by the dramatic turn of events. "Today," I continued, my voice swelling with fierce, unapologetic pride, "is the official launch party for the Nana Pearl Foundation." I gestured toward the massive projection screens behind the altar. The humiliating video of DeAndre and his family vanished. In its place, a beautiful high-definition photograph of my grandmother appeared. Nana Pearl was smiling warmly, wearing her simple work uniform, her eyes shining with the quiet strength that had built my entire empire. The Nana Pearl Foundation is a $10 million grant program fully funded in cash by Vanguard Holdings, I declared boldly. This foundation is dedicated exclusively to supporting working-class Black female entrepreneurs right here in the city of Atlanta. We are going to provide the seed capital, the mentorship, and the commercial real estate resources these brilliant women need to build their own empires from the ground up. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the powerful business leaders in the crowd. My grandmother scrubbed floors so I could have a chance at a better life, I said, my voice thick with genuine emotion. She taught me that true power comes from financial independence. Through this foundation, we are going to ensure that the hardworking women of this city never have to depend on a man or compromise their values for a fraudulent family to achieve their ultimate success. We are going to build real generational wealth that cannot be repossessed, foreclosed on, or stolen by arrogant predators. The crowd absolutely erupted. The deafening cheers and thunderous applause echoed off the stained glass windows, shaking the very foundation of the chapel. The Atlanta elite. The same people who had sneered at my background just hours ago were now giving me a massive, enthusiastic standing ovation. They raised their glasses high into the air, toasting to my grandmother's incredible legacy and the spectacular destruction of the fake empire that had tried to erase her. Xavier walked up to the staging area, his sharp suit immaculate. He carried 2 crystal flutes of premium champagne. He handed one directly to me, a proud, knowing smile lighting up his face. "Outstanding execution, Madam CEO," Xavier said smoothly. "Thank you, Xavier," I replied. "We make a phenomenal team." I clinked my glass against his, the sharp ring of crystal signaling the absolute end of the war. I took a slow, victorious sip of the champagne. The sweet, bubbling liquid tasted like pure freedom. I turned away from the cheering and walked toward the heavy glass doors leading out onto the balcony. I pushed them open and stepped into the warm Georgia afternoon. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden light over the sprawling skyline of Atlanta. I walked to the edge of the balcony. I looked up at the clear blue sky. "Thank you, Nana," I whispered quietly into the wind. I had finally achieved ultimate justice, complete independence, and spectacular sweet revenge.